This is a lecture about the brain and cranial nerves. This lecture is based on Martini's chapter 16. Here are the learning objectives. The drawing assignments are to draw the different parts of the brain and to draw the lobes and cortical areas of the brain. Okay, so to begin. The major regions of the brain are the brainstem, the diencephalon, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum. That list is in ascending order from the spinal cord moving superiorly. And here's a picture of the four major regions of the brain. The brainstem, which has three parts: the medulla, closest to the spinal cord, the pons, and the midbrain, and then the diencephalon, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum. So let's start with the brainstem. The brainstem includes the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain in ascending order. The medulla is just superior to the spinal cord, then comes the pons, and then comes the midbrain, the most superior part of the brainstem. The brainstem contains many centers, which are collections of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system with specific processing functions. Now remember, nuclei are clusters of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. So what makes a center different from a nuclei, it's a collection of neuron cell bodies, but that have a specific processing function. So a center would be the bigger idea here, less of a little cluster of neurons and maybe more of a cluster mixed with a network. The cell bodies might even be in different parts of the brain, although more often we're just thinking of them close together. So the brainstem has these collections of neuron cell bodies with specific processing functions. And there's a picture of a real specimen of a brainstem showing you the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Okay, so let's talk about the medulla. All of the sensory tracts that are traveling from the spinal cord to the brain and all of the motor tracts that are traveling from the brain to the spinal cord must pass through the medulla. There are many nuclei in the medulla, in addition to these bundles of axons that are passing up and passing down through the medulla. So the three types of nuclei in the medulla are relay stations and processing centers, cranial nerve nuclei, and autonomic nuclei. Relay stations are nuclei that relay information from the spinal cord, the brainstem, other parts, the diencephalon, and the cerebral cortex to the cerebellar cortex. Processing centers are composed of nuclei that process sensory information from the spinal cord and cranial nerves. And these nuclei may relay the information to the thalamus. Okay, now to my mind, that description of relay stations and processing centers is a bit dense and perhaps a little complicated sounding. And, I think it's because neuroanatomy is very detailed and complicated. Okay, so let that description just sort of wash over you. Okay, so a simple and more well-defined bunch of nuclei are the cranial nerve nuclei that receive sensory information from and send motor commands to the head and the neck. There will be a full explanation of cranial nerves at the tail end of the lecture. The medulla contains the nuclei for 5 sensory and/or motor cranial nerves, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. The motor nuclei control the muscles of the pharynx, neck, and back. Since the medulla is just above the spinal cord, it can easily control things that are in the area of the neck and the back because it's just above the spinal cord. Okay. Autonomic nuclei are the last of the 3 types of nuclei in the medulla, and they include reflex centers and the reticular formation. So autonomic nuclei receive input from the spinal cord, the brainstem, cranial nerves, the diencephalon, and the cerebral cortex, and they help regulate heart rate and contractility, blood pressure and blood flow, respiratory rate, and the functions of the abdominopelvic organs. Okay, moving on to the pons. So the pons, which is actually a Latin word for bridge, is recognized by its large anterior bulge, like a big potbelly stove or something. The pons contains ascending and descending tracts that connect the pons to superior and inferior parts of the central nervous system. So, the same as the medulla. All the sensory information coming from the spinal cord to the brain has to go through the brainstem, basically. So, just as in the medulla, so in the pons, there's going to be a lot of traffic going up and coming down. The pons also has the job of connecting the brainstem to the cerebellum by three bundles of axons called cerebral peduncles. The superior peduncle contains tracts that travel from the cerebellum to the midbrain and thalamus, which are just above the pons. The tracts are involved in motor control. The middle peduncle contains transverse fibers that wrap around the pons anteriorly. The transverse fibers interconnect the cerebellar hemispheres. Nuclei in the pons receive information from the cerebral cortex and relay it to the cerebellum through the transverse fibers. This pathway is important for motor planning and coordination. And then the inferior peduncle has afferent or ingoing and efferent or outgoing tracts that connect the cerebellum to the medulla below, inferior. These pathways are important for proprioception and postural control. The pons also contains cranial nerve nuclei. There are 4 of them. In particular, they are the cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. The motor nuclei control the muscles of chewing and facial expression. Respiratory centers in the pons help the medulla control respirations. The reticular formation in the pons regulates autonomic nervous system functions. And if you look to the right here, you see the long orange, I don't know, sort of looks like a long carrot or something in the cartoon over here. That is the reticular formation, and we see that it goes all the way from the medulla up behind here through the pons. Between the pons and the cerebellum is the 4th ventricle, a cavity full of cerebrospinal fluid. And here's our picture again. Okay, the midbrain. The midbrain has an anterior part that carries sensory and motor tracts, because of course, as we've said for the medulla and pons, the sensory tracts have to get up into the brain from the spinal cord, and the motor commands have to get down from the brain into the spinal cord. So there's a lot of ascending and descending traffic through the midbrain. Then the midbrain has a thin tectum, which is the Latin word for roof, that is behind a little passageway called the cerebral aqueduct. The tectum holds up the corpora quadrigemina, or forebody, that consists of the 2 superior colliculi and the 2 inferior colliculi. And if those names seem just a little bit familiar, it's because when we were learning about spinal cord tracts and we learned about the tectospinal tracts, we learned about the superior and inferior colliculi. And if you remember, the superior colliculi had visual input going into them, and the inferior colliculi had auditory input going into them. And both of them had the effect of reacting to unexpected stimuli, whether it be visual or auditory, by making the body reflexively turn towards the visual input or the auditory input, whatever it is. Okay, so to turn towards it and, basically look at it, see what it is, and decide whether it's a dangerous thing that you have to run away from. The anterior midbrain contains the cerebral peduncles. The peduncles carry sensory information to the thalamus and carry commands from the primary motor cortex to motor neurons in the spinal cord. So this is an area of the midbrain where information is going up and information is coming down. The anterior midbrain contains the substantia nigra that helps the basal nuclei of the cerebrum coordinate movement. And we see it in this picture as this markedly gray area over here in the cerebral peduncles. The midbrain contains the nuclei of 2 motor cranial nerves 3 and 4. The motor nuclei control 5 of the 6 extraocular muscles. The midbrain also has a bit of the reticular formation in it, and it contains nuclei in this area that help to maintain consciousness. Okay, so that was the midbrain, and now the diencephalon. So you may have heard of the brainstem, but I think the diencephalon is perhaps an area of the brain that is less well known. It contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, which mostly contains the pineal gland. And I think that you may have heard something about the hypothalamus and the pineal gland, possibly. So where is the diencephalon? It is in the center of the brain. In the picture to the right here, the diencephalon is this darker pinkish colored egg over here, shown in the center of the brain. It contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The diencephalon connects to almost all of the sensory and motor systems of the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. It contains only 2% of the cell bodies in the central nervous system, but it is extremely important. The diencephalon develops in the walls around the third ventricle, a flattened space filled with cerebrospinal fluid during development. The right and the left thalamus, each shaped like an egg, are found in the right and the left lateral walls of the diencephalon. The nuclei of the hypothalamus are found in the anterior floor bilaterally. The epithalamus, which contains the pineal gland, is the roof and posterior wall and floor. There's a picture showing where the thalamus is in a cartoon where it's green, and then in a specimen of a brain in which you can just see the little slight bulge of the thalamus, because most of the thalamus is hidden within the lateral wall of the diencephalon and can't be seen in a mid-sagittal cut. And this is a mid-sagittal cut in this picture. Okay, so let's talk more about the thalamus. The thalamus contains multiple nuclei, or collections of cell bodies. It contains the largest number of nuclei in the central nervous system, and it is the most important sensory processing area in the central nervous system. So I say thalamus and you say sensory processing area. All of the sensory spinal cord tracts, other than the spinocerebellar tract, which goes to the cerebellum, and all of the sensory information from the cranial nerves, other than the olfactory nerve, synapse in the thalamus. So let me take out the exceptions and read the sentence again. All sensory spinal cord tracts and all sensory information from the cranial nerves synapse in the thalamus. So all incoming sensory information that is going to become conscious synapses in the thalamus. The thalamus acts as an information filter that only passes on a small percent of the sensory information. The thalamus relays information about touch, pressure, pain, temperature, and proprioception from the body to the somatosensory cortex. It relays information about vision to the visual cortex and about sound to the auditory cortex. It also sends sensory information to the frontal lobes and the association areas of the cerebrum. The thalamus sends information from motor areas, like the basal ganglia and cerebellum, to motor areas of the brain, including the brainstem, basal ganglia, and cerebral cortex. It helps coordinate conscious and subconscious motor activities. So, although famous as a sensory processing area, it does have motor functions. And here's a picture showing how complex the motor functions are. So if you read the slide and were like, wait a minute, what's going on? The thalamus sends information from motor areas and then it sends information to motor areas. Like, what's going on? Look at the picture here and you'll see that there is information going in very complicated and circuitous pathways from the basal ganglia, which is a structure that helps us control motor function, and the cerebellum, a large part of the brain that helps us control motor function. There's information going from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum to the motor thalamus, and the thalamus is sending information to motor parts of the cerebral cortex, but the cerebral cortex is also sending information back down to the motor thalamus, and also the cerebral cortex is sending information to the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Why such complicated pathways? Well, it turns out that being a perfectly functioning organism capable of all sorts of motor activities requires tremendous amount of innate patterns and then learned patterns on top of them, during, childhood and learning how to, control movements. So we have like our innate pathways, and then we have our learned pathways. And then even so, every time we perform a movement, we have to fine tune the pathway to have it come out just so that we can walk, in perfect balance, so that we can pick up a cup from a table with perfect control, take a sip from a glass without, hitting ourselves in the face with the cup. It all just takes tremendous control. And all of that is done by complicated motor pathways in the brain, of which the thalamus is a part, although it's more famous as a sensory processing area. The thalamus also plays a role in emotional states, learning, and memory. And here is a list that talks about the thalamus, the different nuclei, the functions of the nuclei, and the pathways to the cerebral cortex and other areas of the brain. Okay. So I put a little S if the nuclei and the function had something to do with sensory, pathways, and an M if the nuclei had something to do with motor path. Okay, moving on to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is a collection of around 12 nuclei. It's in the floor of the diencephalon, inferior to the thalamus. It's posterior to the optic chiasm that carries optic nerve input, and it connects to the pituitary gland, which is inferior to it by the pituitary stalk. The inferior mammillary bodies are part of the hypothalamus. They're posterior to the pituitary stalk. The hypothalamus receives sensory input from the spinal cord, brainstem, thalamus, cerebral cortex, cerebral spinal fluid, interstitial fluid, and blood. It sends output to its inputs, the medulla, the thalamus, the pituitary gland, and limbic system. Yep. So here's a picture showing you the inputs to the hypothalamus and the outputs. And over here, the inputs, we have the spinal cord, the brainstem, the thalamus, the limbic system, the cerebral cortex, the retina, non-neural inputs like the blood, interstitial fluids, cerebral spinal fluid, inputs from temperature, osmolarity in the blood, hormone levels, tremendous number of inputs into this small, tiny little area. And then outputs to all of the input structures, and then outputs to the thalamus, which is also, I put it over here, to the autonomic nervous system, to the pituitary gland, which then speaks to the rest of the body with hormones. So just tremendous amount of traffic coming into the hypothalamus and going out of the hypothalamus. So an overview of its functions is interesting. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. It links the nervous system and endocrine systems. It controls drives like thirst, hunger, and sex, and behaviors associated with the drives. It helps set emotional states with the limbic system. It helps control sleep-wake cycles and regulate body temperature, all in this little tiny area of the brain. So now I'm just going to break it down a little bit. That was an overview. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which we talked about a little bit in class. The sympathetic division stimulates tissue metabolism, increases alertness, and prepares the body to respond to emergencies by fight or flight. The parasympathetic division conserves body energy and promotes sedentary activities, and it's called the rest and digest division. As part of the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamus helps to control the heart rate, blood pressure, respirations, and digestive functions. In a stressful situation, information sent to the hypothalamus is followed by a change in autonomic nervous system functions, like an increase in heart rate, respirations, maybe blood pressure, all of which can be coordinated with voluntary responses, such as running away from whatever it is that is causing you stress or dealing with it, fighting. Okay. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and together they control hormone production of hormones that go to the rest of the body. This integrates the nervous system with the endocrine system in the body. The hypothalamus directly secretes oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Those two hormones are not secreted through pathways that go through the pituitary gland nuclei. Okay, we'll learn all about this in endocrine. Oxytocin controls smooth muscle contractions in the uterus, prostate gland, and breast. And antidiuretic hormone increases water resorption in the kidneys. Now, remember I said the hypothalamus controls drives like thirst, hunger, and sex, and their associated behaviors. Well, it directs voluntary and involuntary behaviors to fulfill the drives. For example, if there was stimulation of the thirst center, it would produce the desire to drink and behaviors associated with successfully finding something to drink and drinking it. The hypothalamus controls feeding reflexes like licking and swallowing, and it directs all sorts of motor patterns that are associated with pleasure, pain, and sexual arousal. The hypothalamus has input from the cerebral cortex and limbic system that help it set emotional states. The hypothalamus controls motor patterns associated with rage, interestingly. The hypothalamus helps to control day, night, and sleep wake cycles in the body. It receives direct input from the retina of the eye, and its output adjusts the activities of the pineal gland and the reticular formation in order to control, behaviors like seeking sleep at night. Okay, the final part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus, and it has the important part, the pineal gland. So the posterior epithalamus contains the pineal gland. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, a hormone that helps regulate sleep-wake cycles. And you see in this picture, it looks like a tiny little, like, very small little pea. Pineal makes me think of pea. And when we learn the models, we'll learn how to differentiate the pineal gland from the pituitary gland, where they are, and the pineal gland is much smaller than the pituitary gland, as it turns out. Okay, so now this cerebrum.